Welcome back to Family Shadows, where we bring you stories of quiet fathers, heavy sacrifices, and the truths that come to light when respect is tested. If you've ever believed that a father's silence hides more than words could tell, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join our growing family of listeners who know that every shadow has a story. Today's story is titled, "After the break-in at my house, my son said his wife didn't want me to stay." Edward Harris had lived in that house for nearly 4 decades. It wasn't much to look at if you measured homes the way realtors did, by square footage, curb appeal, or the number of new appliances. But if you measured by something deeper, like the creak of the floorboards that remembered your children's footsteps, or the way the light touched the kitchen table where your wife once sat with her coffee, then it was a mansion. On the night of the break-in, Edward sat in his armchair, the same one he had bought back when the Detroit Tigers still meant something to his son, Mark. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that clings to old wood and makes you wonder if it's listening. He dozed there, wrapped in a faded blanket, when a sound cracked the night open. Glass, shattering. He jolted awake. For a moment he thought he had dreamed it. Then came the shuffle of heavy steps, the unmistakable drag of someone who doesn't belong. Edward's heart kicked against his ribs. He had once been strong, hands that could lift beams, shoulders that could bear the weight of a family's future. But at 62, strength was a memory, not a possession. He reached for the baseball bat that leaned against the wall, not out of bravery but habit. When he stepped into the hallway, the sight stole his breath. His front window was smashed, curtains torn like they'd been clawed open. A man, shadowed and quick, rifled through the drawers near the television. Another one, smaller, yanked open the cabinet where Edward kept his late wife's china, the last pieces of her touch he hadn't yet packed away. "Hey!" Edward barked. His voice cracked, raw and trembling, but it was enough. The men startled, cursed, and fled. Their boots slammed against the porch, then vanished into the night. By the time Edward stumbled outside, clutching the bat, all he saw was the red glare of a taillight disappearing down the road. And then, silence again. But this silence was different. It wasn't the hush of an old house. It was the silence of violation. Edward stood there for a long time, the night air stinging his lungs, his body shaking in a way no bat could steady. When he finally went back inside, the damage spoke louder than words. Drawers yanked out, plates shattered, glass crunching underfoot. And in the corner of the room, the framed photograph of his wife, Margaret, face down on the floor, the glass cracked across her smile. He bent to pick it up. His hand shook so hard he almost dropped it again. "Maggie," he whispered as though she might still hear him. "They took nothing worth keeping, but I lost more tonight than I thought I still had." He pressed the frame against his chest, sat down on the torn couch, and felt a loneliness he hadn't allowed himself to admit in years. The next morning brought no comfort. The police came, young officers with clipped voices and pens that moved too fast. They asked him for descriptions, but all Edward could remember were shadows and the sound of boots. "Any valuables missing, sir?" one asked. Edward glanced around. The television was still there, the old radio too. What had they taken? A few silver spoons, his wife's china maybe. But what they really stole couldn't be reported. It was safety. It was the fragile peace an old man has in believing his home is still his sanctuary. "They took enough," Edward muttered. The officers nodded, filled out their forms, and left him with a pamphlet about neighborhood watches. Edward watched them drive away, then closed the door against the morning sun. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt hollow, stripped bare, like a body missing its soul. For hours he sat in silence, staring at the cracks in the window, the police tape fluttering outside. He thought of calling Mark. His son hadn't visited much these past years. Work, family, excuses that had started to sound more like walls than reasons. But still, he was Edward's son. Still, a son was supposed to care. Edward picked up the phone. His hand lingered on the receiver, trembling. He wasn't calling to ask for money or repairs. He was calling because he needed to hear a voice that reminded him he wasn't alone in this world. When Mark answered, his voice was brisk. "Dad, everything okay?" Edward swallowed. "There was a break-in last night. I don't feel right being here." There was a pause, the kind that stretches wider the longer it lingers. "Are you hurt?" Mark finally asked. "No, just shaken. I see." Another pause. Edward could almost hear the gears turning in his son's head, weighing schedules, obligations, maybe the sound of Sophia in the background. "Dad," Mark said, "why don't you come stay with us for a bit?" Edward closed his eyes. Relief swelled in him, thick and hot. "You mean that?" "Yeah," Mark replied. "It's probably safer that way." Safer. The word meant more to Edward than he let on. That evening, Edward packed a single duffel bag. Not much, a few shirts, his shaving kit, the photograph of Margaret. He left behind the broken dishes, the police tape, the feeling that the house no longer belonged to him. When he pulled up to Mark's suburban home, the lights were warm, spilling onto the driveway like an invitation. Edward stood there for a moment, bag in hand, watching the silhouette of his family through the curtain, Mark, Sophia, and little Lily. He thought of the nights he had worked late to keep the lights on for them, the mornings he had built school projects with Mark on the kitchen table, the sacrifices so quiet they had gone unnoticed. He thought of Margaret, who used to say, "A father's love is loud in the things he never says." Edward stepped up to the door and rang the bell. The door opened. Mark stood there, smiling, though a little too tight. "Dad." "Son," Edward said softly, and for a fleeting second, standing in that doorway, he believed maybe he wasn't as alone as the world had made him feel. Edward had barely set his bag down on the porch when the door opened wider. Mark stepped back to let him in, his eyes darting over his father's single bag as though measuring how long it might linger in the hallway. Edward noticed it, but he didn't say anything. He never did. A father, he thought, carried more on his shoulders than in his suitcase. The warmth of the house hit him first, the glow of overhead lights, the smell of chicken roasting in the oven, the faint hum of a television in another room. Compared to the hollow quiet he had left behind, it was a sanctuary. He wanted desperately to believe he belonged here. "Grandpa!" A small voice broke the tension. Lily bounded down the hallway, her socks slipping on the hardwood floor. She launched herself into Edward's arms, and for the first time in 24 hours, something inside him unclenched. "Careful now," Edward chuckled, hugging her tightly. "You'll knock me right over." Her laughter filled the foyer, scattering the silence like birds startled into flight. Edward kissed the top of her head, grateful that at least one heart in this house still beat warmly for him. Behind them a sound cleared, a throat sharp and deliberate. Sophia. She stood at the end of the hallway, arms crossed, her figure framed against the light from the dining room. She was a striking woman, in that calculated way people became when they cared more about appearances than comfort. Her dark hair was pulled back too tightly, her blouse crisp, her lips pressed into a line that had no welcome in it. "Dad," Mark said carefully, turning to his wife as though asking permission before speaking again. "This is temporary, just until things settle down." Sophia didn't move closer. She didn't smile. Her eyes flicked from the duffel bag on the floor to the old man still clutching his granddaughter. "Of course," she said finally, though her tone suggested the opposite. "But we don't really have the space." Edward felt Lily's small fingers clutch tighter at his sleeve. Children knew more than adults gave them credit for. They could hear the words not spoken, feel the chill that lingered between sentences. "I won't be in the way," Edward murmured. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a man trying to make himself smaller than he had ever been. Sophia's gaze stayed fixed, unwavering. "We'll see." She turned back into the dining room, the click of her heels punctuating each step. Edward set Lily down gently. "Go on, sweetheart," he whispered. "Dinner's waiting." She nodded, but not before giving him one last hug, quick, urgent, like she knew he might need it. Then she skipped after her mother, leaving Edward standing in the doorway with Mark. "You know how she is," Mark muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. She likes order, surprises throw her off." Edward smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry, son, I'll keep to myself." Mark nodded, relieved, as though that solved it. But it didn't. Not for Edward. Not for the man who once built a home board by board, only to find himself unwelcome at its threshold now that it belonged to someone else. He followed his son down the hallway, the duffel bag dragging against his leg, the warmth of the house already cooling in the air around him. The dining table was set neatly for 3, not 4. Sophia moved a place setting with a flick of her wrist as though it were an afterthought. Edward sat where Mark gestured, the chair stiff and unfamiliar. He felt the way guests feel, even though family should never. Over dinner, Sophia asked Lily about her school project. Mark talked about deadlines at work. Edward listened, nodding when someone glanced his way, but rarely did. It was a language he knew well, silence. He had spoken it most of his life, building things instead of talking about them, providing without demanding recognition. But tonight, silence felt less like love and more like erasure. At one point, Lily turned to him, her fork poised midair. "Grandpa, are you going to stay with us forever?" The room froze. Edward felt Sophia's eyes cut sharp across the table. He swallowed. "Just for a little while, darling, until I get things sorted back home." "Good," Lily said, smiling. "I like it when you're here." Sophia forced a laugh brittle as glass. "Well, we'll see how it goes." The words weren't loud, they didn't have to be. They were cold enough to echo. Edward lowered his gaze to his plate. The chicken was tender, the potatoes buttery, but nothing tasted like it should. It was food, not a meal. It filled the stomach but starved the soul. When the table was cleared, Sophia excused herself, claiming laundry. Mark disappeared into his office. Lily curled up with a book on the couch, and Edward sat in the living room, his duffel bag still by the door, untouched. He hadn't been offered a room. He hadn't asked for one. He sat there in the half-light, staring at the family photos on the wall, Mark in a suit at his wedding, Sophia smiling perfectly beside him, Lily in pigtails holding a trophy. There was no place for Edward in the frames, no space carved out for the man who had raised the boy in those pictures, who had worked late nights and early mornings so that one day his son might have walls strong enough to hang his own photographs. The house was warm, but Edward had never felt colder. That first night in his son's house, Edward lay on the living room sofa, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the street lamp cut across the plaster. The cushions were too firm, the blanket too thin. He listened to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint tick of the thermostat on the wall, and the muffled voices upstairs, Mark's and Sophia's, layered in tones he couldn't quite make out but could guess well enough. It had been years since Edward had shared a roof with his son, but in those hours the distance between them felt wider than ever. He thought of Margaret, her gentle hand on his shoulder whenever work pulled him late, her steady voice reminding him, "Home isn't where you sleep, Ed, it's where you're wanted." He turned onto his side, clutching the blanket tighter. For the first time since the break-in, he wondered if he'd made a mistake coming here. Morning brought little relief. Edward rose early, as he always had, long before the rest of the house stirred. He made coffee the way he used to for Margaret, slow and careful, letting the aroma fill the kitchen. It was a small rebellion, a way of reminding himself that he was still capable of bringing warmth to a place, even if that place no longer asked for it. When Lily wandered in, rubbing her eyes, he poured her a glass of orange juice and set it at the table. She smiled, the kind of smile only children give, unreserved, uncalculated. "Grandpa," she said, climbing onto a chair, "can you walk me to school today?" Edward's chest tightened. "If your parents don't mind," he replied. Before Lily could answer, Sophia appeared in the doorway, her heels already on, her phone in hand. She paused when she saw the two of them, her expression unreadable. "I'll take her," Sophia said. "It's on my way." Lily pouted, "But I wanted Grandpa to come." Sophia's lips curved into something like a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Another time, sweetheart, Grandpa needs his rest." Edward lowered his gaze. "She's right, Lily. Another time." The girl's disappointment stung more than the refusal itself. He sipped his coffee quietly, the bitterness sharper than usual. The days that followed blurred into a pattern Edward knew too well, existing without belonging. He kept to the edges of the house, careful not to disturb Sophia's rhythm. He folded the blanket on the sofa each morning, washed his own dishes after every meal, even offered to mow the lawn, though Mark waved him off with an awkward smile. At dinner, conversation moved around him like water around a stone. Mark spoke of work deadlines, Sophia of neighborhood events, Lily of school projects. Edward listened, nodding, offering small comments that fell into silence. One evening, when Lily proudly showed off a drawing she had made, bright colors spilling across the paper, she handed it first to Edward. "It's us," she said, pointing. "Mom, Dad, me, and you." Edward smiled, tracing the crayon lines with his finger. He looked up to see Sophia's tight expression, the way her jaw clenched as though the picture had drawn a boundary she didn't approve of. "Beautiful," Edward whispered, kissing the top of Lily's head. "I'll keep it safe." Later that night, when he reached into his duffel bag to tuck the drawing away, he noticed it was thinner than before. Not because anything had been taken, because he had almost nothing to begin with. A few shirts, a razor, and that framed photo of Margaret. That was what his life had boiled down to, a suitcase that could fit under a coffee table. On the fourth day, Edward overheard them. He hadn't meant to. He had gone upstairs quietly, intending only to use the bathroom. But the door to Mark and Sophia's room was ajar and voices spilled out. "I told you this wouldn't work," Sophia was saying. "It's been days, Mark, days. He's in our living room like a guest who won't leave." "He's my father," Mark replied, his voice low. "And I'm your wife," Sophia shot back. "We can't build a life of our own if he's always here. This isn't his home, it's ours." There was silence, then Mark's sigh. "Just give it time." "Time," Sophia repeated bitterly. "And how much of it exactly until he understands he's not wanted?" Edward froze in the hallway, the words striking harder than any fist. He retreated back down the stairs, each step heavier than the last. When he reached the bottom, he sank into the sofa, his hands trembling. He had never asked for much. Not praise, not recognition. All he had wanted was a place where, After a life of giving, he might still be allowed to sit without being treated as a burden. But in his son's house, he was not family. He was a guest who had already overstayed. That night, Lily tiptoed into the living room in her pajamas, carrying a blanket too big for her small arms. She draped it over her grandfather, whispering, "So you're warm." Edward's throat tightened. He reached out, brushed her hair back gently, and whispered back, "Thank you, sweetheart." And when she left, the living room fell silent again. Edward lay back, staring at the ceiling. The house smelled faintly of detergent and new paint, a far cry from the sawdust and coffee that had once defined his own home. He thought of the broken window, the shattered china, the photograph of Margaret cracked on the floor. Maybe, he thought, home wasn't stolen by the men who broke in. Maybe it was lost when your own family stopped making room for you. Edward closed his eyes, the blanket warm across his chest, the weight of absence heavier still. And for the first time, he began to wonder not how long he could stay, but how soon he should leave. By the end of the week, Edward had learned to read the silences of the house almost better than its sounds. The squeak of a faucet upstairs told him Sophia was getting ready for bed. The muffled thud of a closing laptop signaled Mark was done working for the night. The creak of the stair at the top landing always announced Lily sneaking down for a glass of water. But that evening, silence had a different weight. It pressed against the walls, hovered over the dinner table like smoke. Edward felt it the moment he sat down. The table was set neatly, 4 plates this time, though one had been placed almost reluctantly at the end. His seat. Lily sat beside him, chattering about a spelling bee at school. Edward smiled and nodded, encouraging her every word. But across the table, Sophia's fork barely touched her plate, her eyes drifting toward Edward with an unspoken impatience. Finally, she set her fork down. The soft clink echoed louder than it should have. "Mark," she said, her gaze steady, "we need to talk about this arrangement." Edward kept his eyes on his plate. He didn't want to hear it, not like this, not in front of Lily, but the words kept coming. "It's been a week," Sophia continued. "And while I respect what happened at his house, we can't go on like this. This isn't sustainable." Mark shifted uncomfortably. "Sophia." "No." She cut him off, her voice cool. "We agreed our home would be a space for us, for our family. Bringing your father here without limits disrupts that. I can't keep pretending it doesn't." Edward's hand tightened around his fork, though he hadn't lifted a bite. He thought of responding, of reminding her that without his labor, without his sacrifices, this family wouldn't even have a table to sit at. But he swallowed the words. He had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of strength. "Mom," Lily piped up suddenly, her small voice breaking through the tension. "Grandpa doesn't make noise, he's nice. I like him here." Sophia turned to her daughter, forcing a smile. "Sweetheart, this isn't about liking, it's about balance." Edward caught Lily's confused glance, her little brow furrowed and his chest ached. He placed a gentle hand over hers. "It's all right, Lily. Your mom just wants what's best." Sophia's eyes flicked to him, sharp as glass. "Exactly." The rest of the meal passed in fragments. Mark tried to steer the conversation toward work, but his voice wavered. Lily pushed peas around her plate, silent now, her earlier joy dimmed. And Edward, though his stomach rumbled with hunger, barely touched his food. The chicken was tender, the wine was poured, but it all tasted like ash. When the plates were cleared, Sophia gathered the dishes with brisk efficiency, her heels clicking against the tile as she moved back and forth to the kitchen. Mark lingered by the table, hands in his pockets, not meeting his father's eyes. Edward sat there, staring at the empty plate before him. He felt like a placeholder, something set at the table not because it belonged, but because it was impolite to leave it out entirely. He thought of his own dinners long ago, Margaret humming as she set the roast on the table, Mark laughing through a mouthful of mashed potatoes, the clatter of forks against plates filling the air with warmth. Back then, the table had been the heart of their home. Now it felt like a battlefield, every word another shot fired. After Sophia disappeared into the kitchen, Mark finally spoke. His voice was low, almost apologetic. "Dad, she's just adjusting. Give it time." Edward met his son's eyes. For a brief moment, he saw the boy he once carried on his shoulders, the boy who used to cling to him after nightmares, who once trusted his father's presence as safety itself. But now, that boy was buried beneath layers of hesitation, compromise, and a marriage Edward didn't dare criticize. "Time," Edward said quietly. "Yes, that's something I've given plenty of." He rose from the table, the legs of his chair scraping softly against the floor. Lily looked up at him, her eyes wide, almost pleading. He bent to kiss her forehead. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. Then he walked to the living room where his duffel bag still sat by the door, as though reminding him each day that he was never meant to stay. The house behind him hummed with order and comfort, but in Edward's chest, the cold of that dinner lingered, sharper than the night air outside. The following morning, Edward slipped out before anyone stirred. The house was quiet, Mark still upstairs shaving, Sophia's alarm not yet rung, Lily tucked safely in her dreams. Edward left a note on the counter in his careful handwriting. "Gone to check on the house. Back later." He pulled his old pickup out of their driveway, the engine coughing before catching, and headed toward the place he still called home. The streets grew older as he drove, manicured lawns giving way to cracked sidewalks, tall new fences giving way to sagging porches. When he pulled up to his house, the police tape still fluttered weakly across the front door, a tired yellow flag in the morning wind. Edward sat for a moment in the cab, staring. The window was still broken, a gaping wound in the siding. The sight made his chest tighten. This was his fortress once, built nail by nail, brick by brick. Now it looked like a place left behind. He stepped inside. The smell hit him first, dust, stale air, a faint mustiness from where the cold had seeped through the broken glass. Shards still glittered on the floor. He walked carefully, his boots crunching. The drawers had been yanked open and left that way. Cabinets stood ajar. The television sat lopsided, wires hanging loose though somehow untouched. Edward walked slowly through each room, noting what was gone. Margaret's china, yes. A few small tools from the garage. A watch that had belonged to his father, but not the things that mattered most. Because the things that mattered most weren't things thieves would notice. He entered the back room, his old workshop. Dust coated the workbench where his hands had once shaped wood into cabinets, picture frames, even Lily's toy chest. On the far shelf, half hidden beneath tarps and old rags, sat a wooden box. Edward froze. It was still there. He pulled it down with trembling hands, brushed away the dust, and set it on the bench. The hinges creaked as he opened it. Inside lay the ledger. The book was thick, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed from years of handling. Edward had kept it since his 20s, a habit picked up from his father, recording every expense, every loan, every payment made and received. But over time, it had become more than a book of numbers. It was the silent record of his sacrifices, a story told in receipts and signatures rather than words. He flipped through the pages. There was the down payment on the house, the loan he'd taken to send Mark to college, every installment carefully checked off. The medical bills from Margaret's illness, heavy and relentless, but paid in full because Edward had worked nights at the mill to cover them. And tucked in the back, folded neatly, were the deeds, the house, the land it sat on, even the small parcel up north where Edward had once dreamed of building a cabin by the lake. Every paper bore his name, his signature, proof that while his son and daughter-in-law saw him as a burden, he was still the foundation beneath their feet. Edward sat on the stool, the ledger open before him, his hands pressed against its pages. A rush of memories came, Mark as a boy, riding on his shoulders, Margaret laughing at the kitchen table, long winters when Edward had patched the roof with his own hands so his family wouldn't feel the cold. They had forgotten, or perhaps never truly known, but this book remembered. He closed the ledger gently, as if afraid to wake something inside it. He slipped the deeds into his jacket, tucking them close. The weight against his chest felt different than the blanket Lily had draped over him. This was heavier, sharper. It was not comfort. It was resolve. Edward lingered in the house a while longer, sweeping glass into piles, setting upright a toppled chair. He paused at the photograph of Margaret, its glass still cracked across her smile. He traced her face with his finger. "You tell me to forgive," he whispered. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. They need to know, Maggie. They need to remember whose hands built the ground they walk on." The afternoon light slanted through the broken window, illuminating the dust in golden shafts. Edward packed the ledger back into its box, slid it under his arm, and locked the door behind him as best he could. When he climbed into his truck, he didn't start the engine right away. He sat there, staring at the house. It was bruised but still standing, like himself. And maybe, just maybe, it had one more purpose to serve, not as a place of comfort anymore, but as a reminder. He turned the key, the truck rumbled to life, and Edward drove away, the ledger resting on the seat beside him. Some burdens were never meant to be shared aloud. But this one, this proof of his worth, his quiet sacrifice, would not stay hidden much longer. The Harris household was noisier than usual that Saturday evening. Sophia had invited her sister and her husband over, filling the dining room with laughter, polished plates, and the smell of rosemary chicken. The table gleamed under warm light, wine glasses catching every glint. Edward sat at the far end, almost out of the circle of glow, as though the light had been measured to exclude him. He wore his one good shirt, pressed as neatly as his old hands could manage, the folded deeds tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. The ledger rested in the duffel bag he had carried back with him, hidden by the sofa in the living room. Conversation flowed around him. Sophia's voice rose often, bright and commanding, painting pictures of new projects, her yoga group, the upgrades she and Mark wanted to make to the kitchen. Her sister laughed easily. Her husband nodded with approval. Mark contributed when asked, his laughter short, his eyes shifting occasionally to his father, as though checking to see if Edward was still breathing, still there. Edward ate quietly, his fork moving without appetite. Lily sat beside him, her small hand brushing against his sleeve now and then, a silent reassurance that he wasn't invisible. But the illusion of peace broke midway through the meal. Sophia poured herself another glass of wine, her nails clinking against the crystal, then looked directly at Edward. The room seemed to still, though no one else noticed. "So, Edward," she said, her voice lined with politeness so thin it cut, "have you thought about what's next?" Edward set his fork down. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Sophia continued, swirling the wine in her glass, "your house isn't safe anymore. And this," she gestured vaguely toward the sofa in the other room, "isn't a permanent solution. You need something more suitable." Mark shifted in his chair. "Sophia." "No, Mark," she interrupted, her tone sharper now. "We have to be realistic. This arrangement can't go on forever. We need our space. Lily needs stability. You need. What about what I need?" Edward's voice cut through, quiet but firm, stopping her mid-sentence. The table fell silent. Even Lily looked up, startled by the sound of her grandfather's voice, heavier than usual. Sophia blinked, caught off guard. "I'm only saying." "I know what you're saying," Edward replied, his eyes steady. "I've heard it in your tone since the night I stepped through that door. You want me gone, not tomorrow, not next week, but soon, sooner than soon." Sophia's lips tightened, but she didn't deny it. Edward reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. His hands were steady now, not trembling as they had been the night of the break-in. He placed the paper on the table, smoothing it with care, like a man laying down a final card. "What's this?" Mark asked, frowning. Edward looked at his son. "Deeds to the house I live in, to the land it sits on, to the parcel up north you've forgotten even exists." Mark blinked, confused. Sophia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "I still own them," Edward said, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Every board, every beam, every acre. I paid for them with years of my life, with nights you don't remember and mornings you never saw. I built them for a family, for you, and I still hold them." The silence that followed was heavier than any spoken word. Sophia's sister glanced awkwardly at her husband, both suddenly fascinated by their plates. Mark's face paled, his fork clattering onto the table. Sophia tried to laugh, but the sound was brittle. "Well, of course you own them, but what does that?" "It means," Edward interrupted gently, "that I am not a guest in this family, not a burden, not a man waiting for permission to sit at a table I built. I may be quiet, Sophia, I may not speak much, but do not mistake silence for absence." Lily reached out, slipping her hand into Edward's. He squeezed it gently, a lifeline amid the storm. The air around the table was thick, charged. Sophia pressed her lips together, her cheeks flushed. Mark opened his mouth as though to speak, then closed it again, trapped between loyalty to his wife and the undeniable truth his father had placed before him. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gaze calm. He had said enough, for now. The ledger was still in the living room, waiting. Its pages carried more stories than Sophia could ever silence, more evidence than Mark could ignore. But tonight the first stone had been laid. Edward Harris, the silent guest, was silent no more. The night after that dinner, the house seemed to hold its breath. Sophia busied herself upstairs longer than usual, slamming drawers, her footsteps pacing back and forth. Mark sat in his office with the door closed, the blue glow of his computer screen spilling into the hallway. And Lily, sensing the tension though no one explained it, curled against Edward on the sofa, her head resting on his chest as she drifted to sleep. Edward stroked her hair, staring at the shadows flickering across the ceiling. His hand rested on the ledger tucked beneath the cushion beside him. He could feel its weight like a stone pressing into his ribs. He had carried it for years, quiet proof of a life poured out in sacrifice. But tonight, he knew, silence would no longer serve. The following Sunday, Sophia insisted on hosting brunch. She set the table with her best china, laid out fresh flowers, and spoke briskly about neighbors who might stop by, about appearances and presentation. She was polishing the last glass when Edward entered, the ledger under his arm. Her eyes darted to it. "What's that?" she asked, her tone sharp, defensive. Edward offered no explanation. He simply took his seat at the end of the table, placed the leather book before him, and waited. Mark came in a moment later, adjusting his tie, though it was only brunch. Lily skipped behind him, humming, her innocence a rare melody in the thickening air. When everyone had settled, Edward opened the ledger. The creak of its spine was louder than it should have been, turning heads. He flipped slowly through the pages, pausing here and there, his fingers tracing the faded ink of old numbers, dates, signatures. "This," Edward began quietly, "is my life story, not told in words but in sacrifices." Mark frowned, shifting uneasily. Sophia crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. Edward turned a page. "Here, the loan for your college, Mark. Every payment marked, every month on time. You walked across that graduation stage because these hands worked nights in the mill. Here," he flipped further, "Margaret's hospital bills, paid in full. I sold my truck that year, so you wouldn't see the debt collectors at our door." His voice wavered, but he pressed on. "And here the deed to the house you call unsafe, my house, my land, built with the same hands that raised you." He looked up at his son, then at Sophia. "You speak of me as though I am an intrusion, as though I've wandered where I don't belong. But this family walks on ground I laid, eats at a table I bought, lives in the warmth of sacrifices you have forgotten." Sophia opened her mouth, but Edward raised a hand, steady and commanding. "I am not here to beg for space. I am here to tell you how this will go." He pulled a folded document from the back of the ledger and laid it flat on the table. It bore signatures, notations, stamps. "This," Edward said, "is the foundation of my decision. Effective immediately, the assets tied to my name, the insurance payout from the break-in, the land, and what little savings I have left will be placed into a trust." Mark's brow furrowed. "A trust?" "For Lily," Edward said simply, glancing at his granddaughter. "For her education, her future. Not for vacations, not for new kitchens, not for appearances, for her." Lily's eyes lit with innocent curiosity. "For me?" she whispered. Edward smiled gently. "For you, sweetheart, so you'll never mistake silence for weakness or sacrifice for absence." The room went still. Sophia's face flushed crimson, her hand tightening around her wine glass. "You can't just—" "I can," Edward interrupted, his voice steady as oak. "Because it is mine, and because I will not see my life's work dismissed as the baggage of an old man. You wanted me gone, Sophia. Consider this my answer. I will go, but I will not leave empty. I leave a legacy." Mark's face twisted, caught between shame and helplessness. He looked at his father, then at his wife, then down at the papers on the table. He said nothing. Sophia, her jaw tight, leaned back in her chair. "So this is your lesson, your grand gesture." Edward closed the ledger with a soft thud. "No, Sophia, this is not a lesson. This is a reminder of where you came from, of who built the roof over your head, and of what will outlast your contempt." He rose, slid the ledger under his arm once more, and kissed Lily's forehead. "My place may not be here," he said, looking at his son one last time, "but my love will remain in ways you cannot erase." With that, he walked toward the door. His duffel bag was already packed. Edward Harris stepped out into the afternoon sun, the weight of his duffel slung across his shoulder, the old ledger pressed firmly against his side. The air smelled of cut grass and the faint sweetness of spring, though inside, the echoes of the confrontation still rang. Behind him, the house that belonged to his son but not to him stood silent. Mark had not followed. Sophia had not called after him. Only Lily, pressed against the window, lifted her hand in a small, desperate wave. Edward raised his hand back, steady and reassuring, before turning down the street. He didn't walk quickly. There was no need. Every step was measured, calm, the steps of a man who no longer needed to prove his worth. The truth had been spoken. The records had been laid bare. His silence was no longer mistaken for weakness, but revealed as the foundation of his strength. At the end of the block, Edward paused. He pulled the ledger from his bag, opened it one last time, and stared at the pages filled with decades of sacrifice. These were not just numbers. They were proof of love, quiet and enduring. He thought of Margaret, whose laughter still lingered in the corners of his memory. "You'd be proud, Maggie," he whispered. "Not of what I left behind, but of what I refused to lose." He closed the book and tucked it away. Edward knew where he would go next. Pastor Lewis had once offered him a small room near the chapel, a simple place, quiet, with no polished china or brittle laughter. Perhaps there he could rest, perhaps even rebuild, and perhaps he would find peace in watching Lily grow into the future secured in his trust. What mattered now wasn't a roof or even recognition. It was the legacy of dignity, carried forward in the life of the only person at that table who had truly seen him. As Edward walked on, his figure grew smaller against the horizon, but his shadow stretched long, steady, and unbroken. A father's shadow. This has been another story from Family Shadows. Thank you for walking with us through Edward's journey, through silence, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of a father who refused to be erased. May this remind us all: love is not measured in words spoken at the table, but in the foundations laid long before. If you found meaning in this story, we invite you to subscribe, share your thoughts below, and keep joining us for more tales that honor the fathers, mothers, and families who shape our lives. Until next time, we wish you health, peace, and happiness in your families. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.